It could turn 25 tons of molten iron into steel in 20 minutes. No furnace, no fuel, just air, forced through liquid metal, hot enough to kill you from 15 feet away. That's not a typo, and it's not an exaggeration. That's the Bessemer converter. And for about 70 years, it was the single most important machine in the industrialized world. It built the rails that crossed a continent. It built the skeletons of the first skyscrapers. It built modern America in roughly one generation. And it did it so fast and so cheap that nobody back then had time to ask what it was going to cost. We know now. We have the numbers. We have the bodies. The first time Henry Bessemer ever ran his invention, it didn't perform. It erupted. Sparks, molten slag, splashes of metal thrown high enough to set the roof on fire. He called it a volcano in his own memoirs, and this was the machine at its calmest, in a small workshop, with nobody standing too close. Scale that up to 25 tons in a vessel 6 feet across, install it inside a mill with 300 men working 12-hour shifts around it, and you start to understand why this story has a body count nobody ever fitted it adding up. Here's the question we're going to answer today. How did a machine that made steel almost insultingly cheap also become one of the deadliest workplaces in American industrial history? And why, more than a century after the last one went cold, are the rotting remains of these things still costing money, still costing land, and in at least one case, still leaking poison into a major American harbor right now? Stick with me. The fire went out a long time ago. The bill never did. The 10-minute miracle. Before 1856, steel was a luxury item. Not steel like we think of it. Structural. Everywhere. In your car, your bridge, your kitchen sink. But a rare, expensive, painstaking material that took skilled men hours to coax out of small batches of iron and clay crucibles. You could make a sword out of it. You could not make a railroad out of it. The world ran on cast iron and wrought iron instead, both weaker, both heavier, both prone to cracking under the kind of stress a growing industrial nation was about to put on them. There was a hunger building in the 1852 for something stronger, something that could be made by the ton instead of the pound. Nobody had found a way to do it. The old method, puddling, men with iron rods stirring molten metal by hand for hours at a time, leaning into heat that could blister exposed skin in minutes, had a hard ceiling. You couldn't hire your way past human muscle, and you couldn't lay a continent's worth of railroad track one hand-stirred batch at a time. The antagonist in this story isn't a person. It's scarcity itself, and the brutal, exhausting labor that scarcity demanded from anyone trying to beat it. Henry Bessemer wasn't trying to solve any of that. He was trying to build better artillery for the Crimean War. Iron cannon kept failing under the recoil of his new ammunition designs, and in chasing a stronger metal for guns, he stumbled onto something much bigger. His insight was almost insultingly simple. Force air through molten iron, and the oxygen will burl the carbon and silicon impurities right out of it. No additional fuel needed. The reaction itself generates enough heat to keep the metal liquid through the whole process. On paper, it sounded like something a chemistry student might sketch on a napkin. But in practice, the first time he tried it, the converter tried to kill him. Bessemer wrote about it himself years later. 10 minutes of quiet, sparks rising the way they do off any ordinary furnace. Then, the reaction hit its stride, and what had been a controlled burn turned into what he called a veritable volcano in a state of active eruption. Mild explosions, molten slag thrown skyward, flames licking at the zinc roofing of the building he was standing in. Nobody could get close enough to shut off the air blast. The building nearly caught fire from its own steel. It was, in other words, the public debut of a machine that would go on to define an entire industrial age. And it announced itself as dangerous on day one, and it never stopped being dangerous for the rest of its working life. But it worked. That was the part that mattered to everyone except the man standing closest to it. Bessemer had found a way to do in 20 minutes what used to take the better part of a day, with a fraction of the manpower, and at a fraction of the cost. Word crossed the Atlantic fast. An American named Andrew Carnegie, a railroad man turned industrialist, sharp enough to see exactly where the world was heading, built his first steel plant around this exact technology. The Edgar Thomson Works went up on the banks of the Monongahela River outside Pittsburgh, and on August 22, 1875, its Bessemer converter produced its first heat of liquid steel. Within a year, that single mill turned out over 32,000 tons of steel rail. A magazine writer who toured the works a few years later struggled to find ordinary words for what he saw. Colored fire shooting straight up out of the converter mouths. The whole yard washed in shifting light. The dull Pittsburgh sky suddenly looking like it belonged to somewhere else entirely. People didn't know whether to be afraid of it or in love with it. Both, probably. Crowds came to watch the blow the way people now watch fireworks. Except this fireworks display was happening 20 feet from working men, hour after hour, day after day, and there was no safe distance once your shift started. What Carnegie understood, and what his rivals were slower to grasp, was that this machine didn't just make steel faster. It made steel that was cheap enough to put railroads across an entire continent. Cheap enough to frame buildings taller than anyone had ever built before. Cheap enough that an industry built on scarcity suddenly had none. Newspapermen who toured the new mills wrote about the converter in the language of religious awe. A man-made volcano, tamed and put to work. Proof that human ingenuity could bend even fire itself into something useful. Few of them lingered on the men standing on the platform around it. The age of steel had arrived, and it arrived loud, fast, and already on fire. They had the beast running now. What they hadn't figured out yet, what would take them the better part of a century, and a body count nobody fully tallied until it was far too late to matter to the dead, was how to keep it running without the building, or the men inside it, paying for every ton it produced. 25 tons in 20 minutes. Picture the vessel itself. A squat, pear-shaped container of riveted steel plate, lined inside with clay or dolomite brick that could survive temperatures north of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, mounted on trunnions so it could tilt and pour like some monstrous teapot, tall as a house when you include the platform the men worked from. Into the bottom went a battery of small holes called tuyeres, and the only thing standing between the operators and the molten iron itself was a few inches of refractory brick and engineering nobody had fully tested at this scale before anyone Carnegie's size tried it. Here's how it worked. It was never, not for one single heat, actually safe. Workers tipped the converter and poured in molten pig iron straight from the blast furnace, sometimes 25 tons at a time, sometimes more. Then they righted the vessel and forced a blast of cold air up through those tuyeres directly into the liquid metal. The air found the silicon first, burning it off in a shower of sparks. Then it found the carbon, and that's when the real violence started. A column of flame would erupt from the mouth of the converter, sometimes 20 feet high, roaring like a blowtorch built for giants. Workers nicknamed it Bessemer's fireworks display, and it's a good name, because for a few minutes at the peak of the blow, the converter looked less like industrial machinery and more like something that had briefly escaped containment. The reaction itself generated the heat. No furnace, no fuel feed, just air meeting molten metal and burning hot enough to refine 25 tons of iron into steel in roughly 20 minutes. Compare that to the old way. A skilled puddler, working alone with an iron rod, taking the better part of a working day to process a few hundred pounds. The math explains everything about why this machine spread as fast as it did. What had cost a fortune in skilled labor and time now cost almost nothing and took 20 minutes. But could the men running it actually control what was happening inside that vessel? Not entirely. And that gap between what the operator wanted and what the chemistry was doing is where most of the danger lived. The blow had to be timed by eye, by watching the color and shape of the flame coming out of the converter's mouth, because that was the only real-time readout anyone had. Too short a blow, and the steel still had too much carbon in it, useless for rail. Too long, and you'd burned away material you needed, wasting the feet and the time. There was no gauge for this. There was a man, staring into fire, making a judgment call that had to be right within a margin of seconds. And then there was water. This is the part that should make your skin crawl a little, because it's the same physics that is still killing steelworkers in American mills today, more than a century and a half after Bessemer's first eruption. Molten metal and water do not mix quietly. A relatively small amount of moisture trapped inside a charge of scrap, or pulled somewhere it shouldn't be when a converter tilts to pour, will flash to steam almost instantly, expanding to roughly 1,600 times its original volume in a fraction of a second. That's not a slow boil. That's an explosion, capable of blowing molten steel and shattered refractory brick across a work floor in every direction, hot enough to kill anyone standing in the blast radius before they understand what's happening. The men running these converters in the 1870s didn't have the vocabulary of modern thermodynamics to explain why this happened. They just knew that wet scrap, a damp ladle, a careless pour near standing water, could turn a routine heat into a catastrophe with no warning at all. Nobody back then could have told you this danger would still be killing furnace workers 150 years later, and it has. The same water into molten metal physics that nearly burned down Bessemer's own workshop in 1856 has been logged by federal safety investigators in steel and foundry operations as recently as the 2022. The exact same violent reaction, the exact same warning that was never fully solved, just inherited by every machine that came after the converter. There was a second, quieter failure built into the design itself, one that wouldn't fully reveal its cost for decades. The air blasted through the converter was ordinary atmospheric air, about 78% nitrogen. Some of that nitrogen got trapped in the finished steel, making it lifelessly more brittle than its makers understood at the time. Bessemer steel held a hidden flaw baked into the very process that made it possible, and nobody fully solved the problem until the 20th century. Rails made from this steel would later be blamed for unexplained brittle fractures, a defect quietly riding along inside every ton the converter produced for as long as it ran. To stand next to one of these vessels at full output was to feel something closer to weather than machinery. A working Bessemer converter could process a single 25-ton heat of liquid steel. Call it the weight of roughly 4 fully loaded city buses, turned molten, contained by a few inches of brick, in about the time it takes to watch a sitcom episode. Multiply that by the dozens of heats a single converter could run in a day, and a mill the size of Edgar Thomson was pouring out, day after day, a volume of liquid metal that would have seemed like a physical impossibility to anyone living a generation earlier. The roar alone could reportedly be heard for miles on a quiet night. This was the trade Carnegie's industry had made, whether it said so out loud or not. Take a force of nature this size, this fast, this close to a few hundred unprotected men, and call the resulting cost the price of progress. Even as Carnegie's converters roared at full output, a rival idea was already creeping in from the other direction. The open hearth furnace, slower, more expensive to run heat for heat, but able to use scrap steel as raw material and offering far tighter control over the final chemistry. It couldn't match the Bessemer converter's speed, not yet. But it didn't carry the same hidden flaw, and it didn't ask men to read fire with their bare eyes and bet their hands on the answer. The competition wasn't loud in the 1870s and 1880s. It was patient. Carnegie himself would eventually install open hearth furnaces at Homestead, running the slower technology alongside the converters at Edgar Thomson, hedging a bet he wasn't ready to say out loud. The Bessemer converter had perhaps 30 good years left in it as the dominant technology of American steelmaking. It just didn't know it yet, and neither did the men whose entire working lives were about to be built around it. The gearing, the chemistry, the speed, all of it was brilliant, on paper. What the paper didn't show was what it actually felt like to stand on that platform, shift after shift, 12 hours at a time, with that fire close enough to feel on your skin, and no real say in when the blast might turn on you. The men who fed the fire. Andrew Carnegie gave his workers exactly one paid holiday a year, the 4th of July. For the other 364 days, the mills at Braddock and Homestead and Duquesne ran on 2 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. And roughly every other week, a man would work what they called the long turn, 24 straight hours, when the day and night crews swapped over on Sunday. A laborer at Homestead told a reporter in the 1890 seconds that he'd lost 40 pounds in his first 3 months on the job. The sweat, he said, ran down his legs and filled his shoes. Another worker described it more bluntly. You don't notice any old men in this mill. The heat, the strain, and the constant swing between scorching and freezing used a man up fast enough that a sociologist studying the industry coined a phrase for it: old age at 40. For this, the average steelworker in 1890 earned around $10 a week, just above what counted as the poverty line at the time. It took the combined wages of roughly 4,000 of these men to equal what Andrew Carnegie personally earned in the same period. 4,000 men, 12-hour days, lungs full of slag dust and metal fume to match one man's income for doing none of it. The noise alone was a hazard nobody had a name for yet. Hearing damage wasn't tracked, wasn't compensated, wasn't even fully understood as an injury in this era. It was simply assumed that a man who worked the mill long enough would eventually go a little deaf, the same way he'd eventually go gray. Add the heat radiating off 25 tons of liquid steel to a Pennsylvania summer, and the platform around a converter in July could push past anything a modern workplace safety standard would tolerate for even a few minutes, let alone 12 hours straight. Men drank water by the bucket and still came off shift, dizzy, dehydrated, sometimes unable to stand without help. None of that showed up in the company ledgers. It showed up in the bodies. Could a person actually survive standing this close to 25 tons of molten steel for 12 hours straight? Mostly, yes. Walking away without a mark on you was a different question entirely. Splash injuries from molten metal and slag were a routine hazard of working anywhere near a converter or a ladle, and protective gear in this era amounted to whatever a man could improvise for himself. Eyes, hands, and exposed skin paid the price for that gap in equipment, heat after heat, year after year. And that was just the cost of things going right. When something actually failed, a hoist cable, a platform grate, a ladle tipped a few degrees too far, the result wasn't an injury, it was a body. One of those bodies belonged to a man named James Grabowski, a steel worker who fell into a ladle of molten steel at a Southside Pittsburgh mill in 1922. The mill kept running that same shift for decades afterward. Other workers swore they could still hear him. Cries for help, then laughter, echoing through the shop floor at certain hours of the night, right up until the building itself was finally torn down in 1960. Call it superstition if you want. What it actually was, underneath the ghost story, was an entire workforce that had no other language for what they'd witnessed and could never quite put down. When the machine kills a man in front of his coworkers and the line doesn't even stop, somebody has to carry that. And sometimes the only place left to put it is a story about a haunting. The numbers on this are not vague estimates pulled from folklore. They're documented. In the 1880 seconds, fatal accidents inside Pittsburgh steel mills accounted for roughly 20% of all male deaths in the city. 1 in 5 men who died in Pittsburgh died because of the mills. In Allegheny County alone, across a single 12-month stretch in 1906 and 1907, investigators counted 195 workplace casualties in the steel mills, 24 of them men who fell from height or into open pits, plus 509 accidents that put workers in the hospital and 76 more that left permanent, disabling injuries. Newspapers ran casualty lists every year that one historian compared without exaggeration to the lists you'd expect from a small Civil War battle. A young investigator named Crystal Eastman spent a year tracking every single industrial death in Allegheny County for what became known as the Pittsburgh Survey, one of the first serious efforts in American history to actually count the human cost of heavy industry instead of just celebrating its output. In that single year, she documented 526 industrial deaths. Steel mills made up the largest share of them. She wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. She was trying to be accurate. And accurate turned out to be devastating enough on its own. Workers had nicknames for the most dangerous stations on the floor. The kind of grim shorthand men use when they need to talk about danger without dwelling on it too long. The pit, the bridge, the blow. Nobody wrote a glossary, because everybody already knew exactly what those words meant and what could happen to you there. We've already told you 20% of Pittsburgh's male deaths in the 1880 seconds came out of these mills. We haven't told you yet what the companies did when somebody finally tried to make them pay for it. For months, sometimes years, a man could work the platform around a converter and walk home every night more or less intact, just exhausted, just older than his birth certificate said he should be. The mill ran, the rails kept rolling out, and underneath all of it, a question was quietly building that the companies running these plants were going to have to answer eventually, whether they wanted to or not. What happens when somebody finally counts what this is actually costing, in lives instead of tonnage, the day they counted the bodies? That question got answered in 1907 and 1908 when Crystal Eastman's Pittsburgh survey went public. 526 deaths in 1 year, hundreds more permanently maimed. Eastman wasn't a crusading outsider with an axe to grind. She tracked down the records herself, case by case, cause by cause, trying to answer one specific question. When a steel mill kills or injures a man, who actually pays for it? The company or the family? And then came the part that turned this from a grim statistic into an accusation. Of those deaths, 235 left behind families who survived to seek compensation. 53% of them, more than half, received $100 or less from the companies that employed the men who died. $100 for a husband, a father, a son who walked into a mill and never walked back out. The companies weren't shy about the math, because at this point there was no law forcing them to be generous. A dead worker was, in the coldest possible accounting, cheaper to replace than to compensate. The steel companies knew exactly what they were running. They had their own internal accident records years before Crystal Eastman published a word. U.S. Steel had begun quietly building in-plant safety programs even before the survey's publicity hit, not because the deaths surprised them, but because the corporation's own centralized record-keeping had already shown them, in cold numbers, exactly how bad it was. They knew. The question was never whether the danger was real. The question was whether anyone outside the company would ever find out badly enough to force a change. In 1892, 4 years before any of that public reckoning, the workers at Carnegie's Homestead plant tried to force a different kind of change. When Henry Clay Frick moved to cut wages while Carnegie was conveniently out of the country, the men struck. Frick's answer was 300 armed Pinkerton guards brought in by barge to retake the plant by force. It went about as badly as that decision deserved to. 10 men were killed in the resulting battle, and thousands more were injured in the chaos. The strike was broken. The union was broken with it. And the lesson Carnegie Steel took away from Homestead wasn't about safety, or fair pay, or the men who died trying to organize against 12-hour days. It was that resistance could be crushed, and the mills would keep running either way. They kept running for another 27 years on that same 12-hour, 7-day schedule before labor tried again, this time nationally. In 1919, roughly 250,000 steel workers across the country walked out, demanding union recognition and an end to the 12-hour day once and for all. The companies broke that strike too. Strikebreakers, propaganda branding the workers as dangerous radicals, and a federal government under Woodrow Wilson that declined to intervene on the strikers' behalf. By January of 1920, the men were back on shift, the schedule unchanged. The demand for an 8-hour day no closer to being met than it had been before 250,000 people walked off the job to ask for it. Pressure kept building anyway, fed by public criticism that never quite turned into law. Then, in 1922, under mounting pressure from reformers and from President Warren Harding himself, the steel industry's own board of directors, led by U.S. Steel's Judge Elbert Gary, commissioned a committee to formally investigate whether the 12-hour day was harming the men working it. Here's the finding they returned, unanimously, to a room of 130 steel directors at a Manhattan hotel. The 12-hour day, they concluded, was not injurious physically, mentally, or morally. The workmen, they claimed, actually preferred it because it meant more money per shift. They even argued, with a straight face, that steel workers suffered less fatigue in 12 hours than other laborers did in 8 because of the rest periods built into the work. Read that again. The same industry that had been burying or maiming workers by the hundreds every year. The same industry whose own internal records had already justified building safety programs before the public ever found out. looked directly at the question of whether grinding men down to old age at 40 was hurting them. And the official answer was no, not injurious. They knew what the mills did to a human body, and they put it in writing that it wasn't happening. It took a personal letter from the President of the United States, threatening legislation if the industry didn't act on its own, to finally force Gary's hand. In 1923, 67 years after Bessemer's converter first erupted in that small English workshop, and 48 years after Carnegie lit the first heat at Edgar Thomson, U.S. Steel finally abolished the 12-hour day. The company didn't change its mind. It just did the math on what Congress might do if it didn't. The machines kept running. The fortunes kept growing. Carnegie became one of the richest men who has ever lived, and spent the back half of his life building libraries with his name on them. Nobody from the boardroom ever stood trial for the men the Pittsburgh survey counted. Nobody at U.S. Steel paid back the families who received $100 for a husband's life. The machine that made steel cheap had also, very efficiently, made the cost of a dead worker cheap too, and that arrangement held for decades after anyone could honestly claim they didn't know. The mill kept its rhythm. The rails kept rolling out across a growing nation. But the clock on this machine, and on the towns that grew up entirely dependent on it, had already started running out. Nobody on that 1922 committee was thinking about what would happen when the beast itself finally went quiet. What's left when the fire goes out? The Bessemer converter didn't survive its own success. By the 1932, it was already commercially obsolete in much of the industrialized world. Pushed aside by the open hearth furnace it had once outpaced, the same rival that had spent decades patiently closing the gap. The flaw that nobody fixed for years, that trapped nitrogen, that hidden brittleness, and the converter's complete inability to use cheap scrap steel as a raw material finally caught up with the technology that had once seemed unbeatable. The last Bessemer converter, running commercially in North America, shut down sometime in the 1960s. As of fairly recently, there's only a single Bessemer shop still operating anywhere on Earth. It's in the Ural Mountains of Russia, a working museum piece nobody quite got around to closing. The machine that built the American century doesn't run in America anymore. It barely runs anywhere. What replaced it eventually replaced almost everything. The basic oxygen process, refined by the mid-20th century, blew pure oxygen instead of ordinary air through the molten iron. The exact same core principle Henry Bessemer stumbled onto in 1856. Just engineered around the flaw that had haunted his invention for 100 years. Electric arc furnaces took an even bigger bite, melting scrap directly instead of starting from raw pig iron at all. The beast that had once made every older method look hopelessly slow had become, itself, the hopelessly slow option. And when that happened, it didn't just take a machine down with it. It took down entire towns that had built their whole identity around keeping that machine fed. Youngstown, Ohio learned this on a single morning in September of 1977. Locals still call it Black Monday. The owners of the Campbell Works walked in and announced the mill was closing, not in 6 months, not after a transition period, but within days. 5,000 workers lost their jobs in roughly the time it takes to read this sentence aloud. Within 5 years, the wider Mahoning Valley had lost 50,000 jobs total. Youngstown's population, once well over 150,000 people, would eventually fall below 65,000. The steel mills that had run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, lighting the night sky orange for generations, went dark and stayed dark. A blast furnace, nicknamed Jenny, the one Bruce Springsteen would later sing about, stood half-forgotten for years before preservationist efforts ran out of money and the structure was finally dynamited in 1997. Springsteen wasn't reaching for a metaphor when he wrote about Jenny coming down. A demolition crew actually showed up with explosives, because by then there was nothing left to do with the wreckage but mourn it out loud, set to music. Youngstown wasn't unique. It was just the loudest, earliest warning of a pattern that repeated itself across an entire region that would eventually earn the nickname Rust Belt. And that name isn't poetic. It's descriptive. Homestead, the site of that 1892 massacre, lost its steelworks too. The mighty plant that once ran 16 open hearth furnaces around the clock eventually reduced to empty lots and a shopping center. Bethlehem Steel, once the second-largest steel maker in the country, the company that supplied naval armor and the beams for some of the most famous skyscrapers and bridges in America, collapsed into bankruptcy by the early 2000s. Its blast furnaces left standing cold along the Lehigh River like a row of rusted tombstones. Youngstown, Pennsylvania, another mill town built entirely around the same industry, watched its steel-making jobs evaporate across the very same decades, with nothing comparable ever arriving to replace them. Town after town that had organized its entire economy, its housing, its churches, its identity, around a machine and an industry that simply stopped needing as many of them and then stopped needing the towns at all. So what's actually still standing of the thing that started all this? Almost nothing, by design. Most Bessemer converters were spacked for their own steel decades ago, fed back into the same industry they'd helped create. One final irony nobody intended. A handful survived as museum pieces, frozen mid-pour, more curiosity than relic. A 25-ton converter that ran until 1974 sits preserved now at the Kelham Island Museum in Sheffield, England, Bessemer's own hometown, in a sense, since that's where his original steel empire eventually rose. Pittsburgh has its own preserved converter on outdoor display, a quiet, rusting monument in the city that built more of these things than anywhere else on the planet. They sit there now, holes in the ground, paint and lining flaking, and almost nobody who walks past them understands what they're actually looking at, or what it cost to build the world standing around them. But the converters themselves were never the real liability. The land underneath them was. Across the old steel corridor, Duquesne, McKeesport, Homestead, Youngstown, former mill sites sat for decades soaked in heavy metals, asbestos, and petroleum byproducts, the kind of contamination that doesn't politely disappear once the smokestacks stop smoking. Cleanup at sites like these typically runs into the tens of millions of dollars apiece, money that has to come from taxpayers, redevelopment grants, or nonprofit heritage corporations, because the companies that caused the damage are frequently long gone, dissolved, or shielded by decades of corporate restructuring. Remediation efforts have been slow, expensive, and in some places are still ongoing, right now, in 2026, nearly 50 years after Black Monday. And in at least one well-documented case, the damage never stopped at all. At the former Sparrows Point steel mill outside Baltimore, environmental reports going back to at least 2005 have tracked dangerously high levels of benzene and naphthalene, both confirmed carcinogens, leaking steadily into the Patapsco River and, from there, into Baltimore Harbor. For years, state and federal regulators knew about the contamination for the better part of a decade before serious containment work even began. Containment efforts have taken even longer than the leak itself has been known about. The fire went out at that mill a long time ago. The poison kept flowing anyway, into open water, while regulators tracked it on paper. Added up, and the full account of the Bessemer converter looks nothing like the version most people learned in school. It built railroads across a continent and skyscraper, frames that touched the clouds, in roughly the time it takes most industries to draw up a 5-year plan. It also presided over a workplace that killed 1 in 5 of Pittsburgh's working men in some years, that paid grieving families $100 for a life, that ran 12-hour shifts 7 days a week for nearly half a century after its own operators privately knew exactly what that schedule was doing to human bodies. It made men rich beyond imagination and used up the men working underneath them at triple the normal rate. And then, when something more efficient came along, it didn't even have the decency to disappear cleanly. It left rusting hulks in fields nobody visits, poisoned ground under towns that never recovered, and at least one harbor but still absorbing carcinogens from a mill that hasn't made a ton of steel in decades. We look at a Bessemer converter today, squat, rusted, pear-shaped, sitting behind a fence in a museum lot, and most people see a quaint piece of industrial history. It isn't that. It's closer to a crime scene that was never fully processed, sitting in plain sight, slowly leaking into the water table while the company that owned it long ago stopped existing to be held responsible. The machine made steel cheap. It never made the bill go away. Somebody is still paying it, right now, whether they know it or not, in remediation costs nobody budgeted for, in a harbor that still tests positive for carcinogens, in towns that never grew back the 50,000 jobs they lost in 5 years. That's the part the postcard version of this story always leaves out. The Bessemer converter didn't just disappear when it became obsolete, the way an old fold gets replaced by a new one. It left behind contaminated ground, gutted towns, and a body count that was undercounted while it was happening and has mostly gone unmentioned since. The triumphant version says it built modern America. That's true. It's just not the whole invoice. The full invoice includes the men who died on the platform, the families who got $100 for it, the towns that organized their entire existence around a machine that owed them nothing in return, and the rust that's still sitting in fields and harbors, quietly collecting interest on a debt nobody ever agreed to pay off. They don't build them like that anymore. Mostly, that's a mercy. The men who fed that fire for $10 a week and old age at 40 paid for that mercy in advance, and nobody ever sent them the receipt.